I am the HOA president.
Ma'am, this is a hospital, not your neighborhood.
The hospital wing moved with that familiar quiet urgency that never really feels silent, just controlled. Shoes squeaked softly against polished floors, monitors chimed in steady rhythms, and distant overhead announcements faded before they became distractions. Nurses walked briskly but calmly, charts tucked under arms, eyes forward, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Patients were wheeled past in beds or guided slowly by family members, everyone giving each other space without needing to be told. It was the kind of environment where every motion had purpose, and nothing happened by accident. The nurses' station sat at the center of it all, a small island of screens, paperwork, and hushed coordination. Staff leaned in to exchange updates, tapped at keyboards, then moved on without lingering. Visitors hovered nearby, unsure where to stand, lowering their voices instinctively like the building itself demanded respect. The whole wing felt balanced, busy but not frantic, the kind of calm that comes from professionals who know exactly what they're doing. That balance made her stand out immediately. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't carrying medical gear. She wasn't wearing scrubs or a badge. She wore a bright HOA-style blazer that looked wildly out of place against the muted hospital colors, pressed and deliberate like she dressed for a meeting instead of a medical floor. In her hand was a clipboard held tight against her chest, pen clipped neatly at the top. She stood near the nurse's station, not close enough to help, not far enough to ignore, just watching. At first glance, people assumed she belonged. Hospitals are full of administrators, coordinators, consultants, and people whose jobs aren't obvious at a glance. The clipboard helped sell it. In spaces like this, nobody questions a clipboard unless it gives them a reason to. Staff glanced at her and moved on, trusting the system, trusting that anyone standing there had a reason. The narrator clocks it immediately, though. This is a medical facility. A hospital wing. A place governed by protocols, licenses, and life-or-death priorities. And she has zero authority here. None. Not implied, not borrowed, not accidental. Whatever power she thinks she carries ends at the front doors. She watched the flow of people with a tight expression, eyes following carts as they rolled past, noting how long nurses paused at patient doors, tracking visitors who lingered near the station. Her head tilted slightly, lips pressed together like she was spotting inefficiencies instead of medical care. She didn't speak yet. She observed. A nurse passed close enough that the edge of her blazer brushed a sleeve. The nurse murmured a quick apology without stopping. Karen didn't respond. She just shifted her weight and kept watching, eyes flicking from the nurse's back to the signage on the wall. Directional arrows. Department labels. Quiet reminders meant for visitors, not enforcement. Patients moved through slowly, some with 4 poles, others in wheelchairs. Family members whispered reassurances, hands resting gently on shoulders. Nobody rushed them. Nobody hurried them along. The pace adjusted naturally, human to human. Karen's gaze followed it all with visible dissatisfaction, like the lack of rigid order bothered her. She glanced down at the clipboard without opening it, fingers tapping the edge. Her pen stayed clipped but ready. A visitor stopped near the nurse's station to ask a question, and a staff member responded with calm efficiency. Karen watched that exchange closely, eyes narrowing slightly, as if the interaction had violated some invisible rulebook only she could see. The narrator doesn't need to speculate. This isn't concern. This is assessment. She's not worried about patients. She's bothered by movement she doesn't control. She adjusted her stance and took a small step into the main hallway, leaving the edge where observers belong. The move was subtle, but it mattered. She was no longer just watching. She was inserting herself into the flow. Her eyes moved faster now, scanning nameplates, room numbers, posted notices. She looked up at the ceiling, then back down the hall, mapping the space like she intended to own it. A nurse noticed and slowed, exchanging a quick glance with a coworker. Not alarmed, just curious. Karen met the look and held it, unblinking like she expected acknowledgement. She didn't get it. The nurse continued on, chart in hand, priorities clear. Karen frowned. The clipboard shifted in her grip. She stepped farther into the hallway, now clearly in the path of routine movement. A medical cart rolled past, and she leaned slightly out of the way, watching it go with an expression that read disapproval instead of relief. The cart disappeared around a corner, and she shook her head once, slow and deliberate. The narrator clocks the escalation trigger forming. She's not lost. She's not waiting. She's building something in her head. Karen lifted the clipboard and finally flipped it open, scanning the page like she was confirming a plan. She didn't write yet. She just looked, then looked up again at the nurse's station. Her shoulders squared. Her posture changed from passive to intentional. Visitors nearby exchanged glances, sensing something off. One man whispered to his wife, asking if she worked there. The wife shrugged. Nobody knew. That uncertainty bought her more time than she deserved. She took another step, now fully committed, eyes locked on the flow of staff and patients like it was a system she'd been assigned to fix. Her pen slid free from the clip with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet wing. A nurse paused mid-step, brow furrowing, attention finally pulled her way. The narrator doesn't need to announce it. This is the moment. The exact point where observation turns into interference, where misplaced confidence decides it knows better than professionals. Karen drew in a breath, gaze sweeping the hallway one last time like she was preparing to speak into authority she didn't have. And that's when she decided the wing needed management. She waited until a nurse slowed near the station, one who looked like she might have a spare second, then stepped just slightly into her path with a polite smile. It wasn't aggressive or abrupt, just enough to get attention without causing alarm. The nurse stopped out of reflex, professionalism kicking in, assuming this was a visitor with a question or someone from administration needing quick clarification. Karen held up one finger gently, the universal sign for just a moment. Her voice stayed calm and measured when she spoke, low enough not to echo down the hallway. She said she didn't want to interrupt care, but she needed to address something she'd noticed. The phrasing was careful, almost courteous, designed to disarm instead of confront. The nurse nodded, listening, already halfway through mentally juggling tasks she needed to get back to. Karen explained that the hallway activity wasn't really compliant with community standards. She stressed compliant like it was a known benchmark everyone should recognize. The nurse blinked, confused but not offended, and glanced around the corridor instinctively. Everything looked normal. Patients were moving safely, carts were passing smoothly, and voices stayed low. Still, she listened because that's what professionals do. Karen leaned slightly toward the hall and talked about flow, how movement needed to be streamlined to reduce disruption. She said quiet hours were being compromised by unnecessary back and forth, and that operational consistency mattered in shared environments. The words sounded polished, like she'd rehearsed them in a mirror. None of them actually fit the situation, but they were delivered with enough confidence to give pause. The nurse responded carefully, explaining that this was an active wing and that staff movement followed patient needs. Her tone stayed neutral, respectful, and patient. She didn't challenge Karen outright because nothing Karen had said was openly hostile yet. It was strange, sure, but hospitals deal with strange interactions all the time. Karen nodded along like she expected that answer, then added that standards existed for a reason and consistency prevented problems. She didn't accuse the nurse personally. She framed it like a systemic issue, something bigger than any one person. That framing was intentional. It made her sound like she was there to help, not criticize. Other staff nearby noticed the interaction and slowed slightly, watching out of the corner of their eye. Nobody stepped in. No alarms were raised. The vibe stayed professional, just tinged with confusion. A patient in a wheelchair rolled past, pushed by a tech who glanced at Karen's blazer and clipboard and kept going, assuming this was above their pay grade. The nurse tried to wrap the conversation up, saying she needed to get back to her patients. Karen smiled again and said she understood completely, but she would be documenting what she'd observed for follow-up. The word follow-up lingered awkwardly in the air. The nurse frowned slightly, not alarmed, just unsure what exactly was being followed up on. That's when Karen pulled out the clipboard fully and flipped it open. The movement was smooth and deliberate, like muscle memory. She rested it against her forearm and scanned the page briefly, pen already in hand. The nurse watched, confused but composed, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen started writing. Not scribbling, not jotting a quick reminder, but writing in full lines, slow and intentional. The pen scratched softly, but in the quiet hallway it sounded louder than it should have. She paused once, looked up at the corridor again, then added more. Whatever she was recording felt official to her, even if it meant nothing to anyone else. The nurse stood there for a beat longer, then politely excused herself and walked away, clearly done with the exchange but unwilling to escalate it. Karen watched her leave, eyes tracking her steps, then returned her focus to the clipboard. Her posture straightened slightly, confidence growing now that she'd taken action. Staff nearby exchanged looks. One raised an eyebrow. Another shrugged subtly. Nobody confronted her. She hadn't broken any rules, just social ones, and hospitals are full of people who don't fit neatly into expectations. Still, the unease was there, settling quietly. Karen moved a few feet down the hallway and paused again, observing another nurse pass with a cart. She wrote something else down, nodding to herself like she was confirming a theory. The cart rolled on without issue, patients undisturbed, care uninterrupted. The contrast between real work and imagined oversight was stark. A visitor whispered to someone beside them, asking if Karen worked there. The response was a shrug. That uncertainty worked in her favor. When people don't know your role, they often give you space by default. Karen took full advantage of that silence. She continued writing, occasionally glancing up to measure spacing, noise levels, and movement like she was auditing a factory floor instead of a hospital wing. Her pen paused, then moved faster, confidence building with every note. Being ignored didn't slow her down. It validated her in a twisted way. No one confronted her yet because nothing had exploded. The situation stayed oddly polite, awkward but contained. Nurses did their jobs. Patients received care. Karen documented a version of reality that existed only in her head. She flipped to a fresh section on the clipboard and smoothed the paper with her palm. Her lips pressed together in concentration. This wasn't a one-off comment anymore. This was becoming a project. She lifted her head, scanning the hallway again with purpose, eyes sharper now, less patient. Whatever line she thought she was enforcing, she clearly wasn't done drawing it. But she didn't stop there. Her confidence grew the longer nobody stopped her, and with that confidence came a sharper edge. She lifted her head from the clipboard and announced, not loudly but firmly, that certain staff movements were disruptive. The word disruptive echoed strangely in a place built around constant motion. Nurses walking briskly, carts rolling, patients being transferred. This was the heartbeat of the wing. Yet she said it like she'd identified a flaw no one else had noticed. She pointed toward a nurse moving between rooms and said the repeated back and forth created unnecessary disturbance. The nurse slowed, confused, glancing down the hall like she was trying to spot the problem. She didn't argue. She simply explained she was responding to patient calls. Karen nodded, but the nod didn't mean agreement. It meant dismissal. She wrote something down anyway. That was the moment people nearby started paying closer attention. Visitors who had been sitting quietly now watched with furrowed brows. A man waiting beside a patient room shifted uncomfortably when Karen told him he needed to wait farther down the hall to maintain order. He asked why. She answered that loitering near care areas caused congestion and wasn't appropriate. Her tone stayed polite, but the authority she implied was unmistakable. He moved, not because he believed her, but because this was a hospital and nobody wanted to cause a scene. That compliance seemed to energize her. She redirected another visitor next, telling a woman with a coffee cup that she couldn't stand near the nurse's station. The woman hesitated, then stepped aside, eyes wide with confusion. Karen watched her go, satisfied, then jotted another note. Routine medical work didn't stop, but it started to bend around her presence. Nurses adjusted their paths slightly to avoid interacting. A tech pushing a cart slowed when Karen stepped into the hallway to gesture where visitors should stand. The tech paused, waited for her to finish speaking, then pushed past, jaw tight. Karen frowned and scribbled again. Phones came out quietly now. Not raised high, not obvious, but angled just enough to record. Hospitals make people cautious, but the behavior unfolding was too strange to ignore. A younger visitor whispered to someone beside them, "Is this lady for real?" The other shrugged but didn't look convinced. Karen noticed the phones and didn't flinch. If anything, she straightened her shoulders and lifted the clipboard higher. Being observed seemed to reinforce her belief that she was doing something important. She spoke again, this time addressing the hallway more broadly, saying movement needed to be coordinated to reduce disruption. Her voice cut through the ambient noise just enough to be noticed. A nurse finally asked who she was reporting to. Karen didn't answer directly. She said documentation was necessary for accountability and that non-compliance would be noted. The phrase non-compliance landed hard in a medical setting. It sounded official. It sounded serious. And it wasn't something anyone expected to hear from a stranger in a blazer. She stepped closer to the nurse's station and gestured for a conversation to pause, telling two nurses that side discussions increased noise levels. One nurse stared at her, stunned, then slowly turned back to her coworker and continued speaking in a lower voice. Karen wrote furiously, pen pressing harder into the paper. Visitors exchanged looks now, the discomfort obvious. A man whispered, "This is wild," under his breath. Another shook his head and said, "Who put her in charge?" The whisper stayed quiet, respectful of the space, but the disbelief spread fast. Karen moved again, positioning herself near a doorway and telling a family they couldn't wait there. She directed them toward a seating area farther down the hall, citing consistency. The family complied reluctantly, eyes darting back toward the room they'd been waiting for. The moment felt wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Care was being delayed not by emergency but by ego. She flipped the clipboard to a new page and announced she was documenting repeated non-compliance. The announcement wasn't loud, but it carried. Heads turned. Nurses paused mid-step. Visitors froze. The idea that someone was keeping a record changed the temperature instantly. A nurse told her, calmly but firmly, that she couldn't direct visitors or staff. Karen responded that she was ensuring operational consistency and protecting patient experience. The words sounded rehearsed, corporate, and completely detached from reality. She nodded as she spoke, like she was convincing herself as much as anyone else. The nurse walked away, choosing not to escalate. Karen watched her go, then wrote again. Each note made her bolder. Each lack of immediate consequence fed the illusion that she had authority. She wasn't correcting behavior anymore. She was asserting control. Phones were fully up now, no attempt at subtlety. People weren't filming out of curiosity anymore. They were documenting something that felt wrong. Karen saw it and didn't stop. She threatened again to document non-compliance, this time more pointedly, saying repeated issues would be addressed. That sentence did it. The realization spread through the wing almost instantly. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overzealous visitor. This was someone actively trying to enforce rules that didn't exist, in a place where real authority mattered more than anywhere else. Staff stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. Visitors stopped assuming she belonged. The unease shifted into something sharper, more focused. People understood now that she wasn't going to self-correct. And that's when people realized she was serious. She stopped pretending she was just observing and started acting like she owned the place. Standing near the center of the hallway, she lifted her arm and motioned for a supply cart to shift to the right, palms slicing the air with authority. The tech pushing it slowed instinctively, confused, then adjusted course just enough to get past her. Karen nodded like she'd just fixed a problem that never existed. That small compliance flipped a switch. She stepped farther into the flow of movement, gesturing where people should walk and where carts should roll, carving invisible lanes through a space that already functioned just fine. Nurses began altering their paths slightly to avoid her, not because they respected her authority, but because nobody wanted to waste time arguing with a stranger during a shift. The hallway bent around her like water around a rock, and she mistook that avoidance for control. She pointed down the hall and told a visitor they needed to move to the other side because they were blocking traffic. The visitor glanced around, saw nothing but open space, then looked back at her with confusion. Karen repeated herself, slower and firmer, emphasizing the word traffic like it belonged in a hospital wing. The visitor complied, uneasy, clutching a bag tighter as they stepped aside. Karen claimed shared facilities had rules, and those rules needed enforcement. She said HOA standards applied anywhere residents gathered, even here. The statement sounded insane in a medical setting, but she delivered it like it was common knowledge. A nurse walking past actually stopped, stunned, then resumed without responding, choosing patience over confrontation. She redirected foot traffic again, stepping into the path of two nurses and waving them to opposite sides of the hallway. One nurse stared at her for a split second, jaw tight, then went around without acknowledging her. Karen scribbled something down immediately, pen pressing hard into the clipboard, irritation creeping into her posture. Patients noticed now. A man in a wheelchair looked from Karen to the nurse pushing him, eyebrows raised. A woman with an 4-pole hesitated when Karen gestured her backward, then looked to the nurse for guidance. The nurse ignored Karen's motion and continued forward, offering the patient a reassuring smile. Karen frowned deeply at that and wrote again. The discomfort spread fast. Staff whispered as they passed each other, eyes flicking toward Karen, tension settling over the wing like static. Visitors hugged walls, unsure where they were allowed to stand anymore. The natural rhythm of care stuttered, not because of emergency, but because someone without authority kept inserting herself where she didn't belong. Karen stepped closer to the nurse's station and told a group of staff they needed to keep conversations shorter to maintain quiet hours. Quiet hours in the middle of an active shift. One nurse looked at her incredulously and said they were discussing patient care. Karen waved that off and said care could happen without unnecessary noise. The arrogance landed heavy. Her voice started climbing, not shouting yet, but louder than it should have been. In a hospital, volume carries weight. Heads turned. A monitor beeped. A patient looked startled. Karen didn't notice any of it. She was locked in, convinced she was restoring order through sheer will. She raised her arm again, directing a cart to stop until the hallway cleared. The cart stopped for half a second out of confusion, then rolled forward anyway. Karen snapped, telling the tech they were ignoring protocol. The tech didn't respond, just kept moving, face set in professional restraint. Karen's pen scratched angrily across the paper. Phones came up higher now, no attempt at discretion. Someone whispered, "This lady's out of control." Another replied, "This is messed up." The wing felt tighter, smaller, like her presence was sucking oxygen out of the space. Karen planted her feet and raised her voice again, this time clearly audible down the hall. She announced that shared facilities required consistency and oversight, and she wouldn't tolerate chaos. The word chaos echoed wrong in a place where actual emergencies were handled quietly every day. A patient flinched. A nurse shot her a sharp look. That look only fueled her. She talked louder, claiming responsibility, insisting standards applied everywhere. The clipboard came up like a badge, her finger jabbing at it for emphasis. Her tone crossed a line from annoying to disruptive, from weird to unacceptable. That was when a uniformed figure at the far end of the wing slowed and turned their head. Security had been walking past, barely aware of the situation until her raised voice cut through the controlled calm. They stopped, eyes narrowing, assessing the scene in seconds. And that's when security noticed. She straightened like she was stepping into a role she believed had been waiting for her all along, lifting the clipboard higher against her chest and clearing her throat to reclaim attention. Her voice carried farther now, steady and confident, pitched to sound official without sounding panicked. She announced that she was overseeing the wing, saying it plainly, like it explained everything that had happened up to this point. The words landed wrong immediately, echoing through the corridor with a weight they didn't deserve. A couple nurses actually stopped walking. Not because they agreed, but because the audacity needed a second to register. Overseeing the wing wasn't a casual claim. That phrase belonged to administrators with badges, credentials, and authority earned through years of work. Coming from a stranger in a blazer, it felt surreal. One nurse blinked hard, then glanced at a coworker like she was checking whether she'd misheard. Karen kept going, encouraged by the brief pause. She talked about liability, stretching the word out like it was a warning label. She said improper movement and unmanaged traffic could expose the hospital to risk, that blocked hallways and inconsistent behavior could lead to accidents. None of it tracked with reality, but she stacked the phrases confidently, like volume could replace legitimacy. She shifted into concern mode next, claiming patient safety was her priority. She said she was protecting everyone, staff and patients alike, and that someone had to step in before things got out of hand. The irony hit hard. The only thing disrupting care was her presence, yet she framed herself as the solution. Her tone softened just enough to sound benevolent, which somehow made it worse. Nurses stood there stunned, hands still, charts tucked under arms, disbelief written all over their faces. One nurse opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then stopped, clearly choosing restraint over confrontation. Another shook her head slowly, eyes narrowing as patience evaporated. The hallway felt tighter, quieter, like everyone was bracing. Karen mistook that stunned silence for validation. She nodded along with her own words, tapping the clipboard lightly for emphasis. She said oversight was necessary in shared environments and that ignoring standards led to chaos. Chaos. In a hospital wing where actual emergencies were handled every day without theatrics. The disconnect was wild. A patient in a nearby wheelchair shifted uncomfortably, looking from Karen to the nurses, unsure who to trust. A family member squeezed the patient's hand, whispering reassurance. That small moment of confusion cut deeper than any argument. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy asserting a title she didn't have. She said she'd been observing patterns and documenting issues, implying some larger process was already in motion. The implication hung there, vague and threatening. Nurses exchanged looks, the kind that communicate volumes without words. This wasn't just annoying anymore. This crossed into interference. Karen raised her voice slightly, not shouting, but loud enough to carry past the nurse's station. She repeated that she was overseeing operations in the wing and expected cooperation. The repetition didn't strengthen her claim. It exposed how fragile it was. Saying it twice didn't make it true. Phones were fully up now, no hiding it. Visitors filmed openly, disbelief turning into concern. Someone whispered, "This is nuts," under their breath. Another said, "How is this happening?" The wing felt charged, like everyone sensed a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. A nurse finally spoke, calmly but firmly, saying Karen needed to step away and stop directing staff. Karen shot back that refusal to comply would be noted. That phrase again delivered with a sharp edge now. Noncompliance. Documentation. Oversight. She clung to the language like it was armor. She leaned into the clipboard, flipping a page and pretending to write something important, eyes darting up to make sure people were watching. Being watched mattered to her. It made the performance feel real. She said she'd ensure administration was informed. Still no names. Still no specifics. Just confidence. The nurses didn't argue with her anymore. They paused, stunned, then collectively chose a different response. They went still. Not frozen but focused. The kind of stillness that happens when professionals decide a situation has escalated beyond discussion. Care continued quietly around her, but the engagement was gone. Karen noticed the shift and misread it completely. She took a half step forward, voice rising again, insisting she was preventing liability and protecting patient experience. The words sounded hollow now, bouncing off walls that didn't recognize her authority. Her confidence started to wobble just a little, but she pushed through it with stubborn pride. A nurse near the station glanced down the hall, eyes locking briefly with a uniformed figure who had slowed to assess the situation. That look wasn't panic. It was recognition. The kind that says, "This is no longer something we handle alone." Karen finished her speech with a stiff nod, like she'd dropped a final verdict. She hugged the clipboard tight against her chest, chin raised, waiting for agreement, compliance, or applause. None came. The wing didn't respond. Nurses didn't move toward her. Visitors didn't nod. The silence stretched, heavy and telling. In that quiet, the imbalance became undeniable. Real authority didn't argue. It didn't posture. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, and everyone felt it when it arrived. Karen stood there, alone in her claim, surrounded by people who had stopped pretending she mattered. That's when pretending she mattered stopped being an option. The security officer didn't rush in or make a scene when he stepped into the hallway, and that calm presence shifted the air immediately. His uniform was simple, badge visible, posture relaxed but alert, the kind of stance that came from dealing with situations exactly like this without drama. He paused for a moment at the edge of the wing, taking everything in with a quick scan: the clipboard, the blazer, the stalled movement, the nurses standing a little too still. Then he walked forward at an even pace. He stopped a few feet from Karen, close enough to be heard without raising his voice, far enough to keep the space professional. He didn't comment on what she'd said or what she was holding. He didn't reference the clipboard or the notes or the way the hallway had tightened around her. Instead, he asked one simple question, his tone neutral and direct, like it was standard procedure. He asked whether she was staff or administration. Karen's response came instantly. She straightened up, shoulders back, chin lifted, like this was the moment she'd been waiting for. She said she was an HOA board member, proud and clear, as if that title explained everything and should immediately earn respect. The words echoed oddly against the hospital walls. A couple nurses exchanged looks, eyebrows lifting in disbelief. A visitor actually let out a quiet, incredulous laugh before catching themselves. The officer nodded once, slow and deliberate, acknowledging the answer without validating it. He didn't react to the title at all. He simply explained, calmly and clearly, that this was a medical facility. His voice stayed even, not sharp, not condescending. Just factual. He said the hospital wing was controlled by hospital administration and governed by medical protocols, not residential organizations. He continued without rushing, stating that staff movement, patient flow, and visitor placement were handled by trained personnel based on care needs and safety. He gestured lightly toward the nurses' station, the carts, the patients moving through the hall. He said outside interference disrupted care and wasn't permitted. The words landed clean, each one shutting down a piece of her claim without attacking her personally. Then he said it plainly, leaving no room for confusion. HOA rules did not apply here. Not in this building. Not in this wing. Not at any time. The sentence felt final in a way Karen's announcements never had. You could feel the relief ripple through the hallway almost immediately. Shoulders dropped. Breathing eased. Nurses relaxed just enough to step back into motion. Karen didn't accept it. Her face tightened, irritation flashing across it before she tried to cover it with confidence. She argued that shared facilities required oversight and that patient safety was exactly why she'd stepped in. Her words came faster now, stacking on top of each other, urgency bleeding through the polish. She said communities had standards and hospitals weren't exempt from accountability. The officer listened without interrupting, hands relaxed at his sides, expression steady. When she paused for breath, he reiterated that she was not authorized to direct staff, visitors, or operations. Still calm. Still professional. Still not debating. He told her she needed to step back and stop interfering with care. Karen scoffed and shook her head, muttering that this was how problems got ignored. She gestured toward the hallway like it was evidence backing her up. Nurses nearby froze again, tension flickering back into the space. A patient looked startled. A family member shifted protectively closer. The officer noticed all of it. He told her more firmly now that continued interference would not be allowed. The tone changed just enough to be unmistakable. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was a directive. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stated consequences like they were part of a checklist. Karen argued anyway. She said she was assisting, not interfering. She claimed she was preventing liability and ensuring consistency. The phrases sounded thinner now, stripped of the confidence they'd carried earlier. Her grip tightened on the clipboard, knuckles whitening slightly. The performance was slipping. Phones were fully up around them, no one pretending otherwise. Visitors recorded openly now, disbelief mixing with concern. Someone whispered, "This is unreal," under their breath. Another shook their head slowly like they couldn't believe she was still pushing. The officer repeated that she needed to leave the wing if she wasn't staff or administration. He said it plainly, without anger, like it was the most obvious conclusion in the world. He waited, eyes steady, giving her a moment to comply. Karen opened her mouth again, ready to fire back, stubborn pride refusing to let go. She glanced around, searching for validation, for someone to back her up. She didn't find it. Nurses had already resumed moving, deliberately ignoring her now. Visitors avoided eye contact. The hallway no longer revolved around her. She started to speak anyway, raising her voice slightly, insisting she had a responsibility to act. The words hung there, fragile and exposed. The officer didn't flinch. He simply watched her, patience visibly thinning but control intact. The tension tightened for a split second, the kind of moment where everyone knows the next move matters. Karen leaned forward just a little, ready to push one more time, convinced she could still bend the situation her way. And that was the mistake. The security officer didn't raise his voice or change his posture when he gave the instruction, and that calm made it unmistakably final. He told her she needed to leave the hospital wing immediately. Not later. Not after finishing her notes. No. The words were clear, evenly spaced, and delivered the way policies are enforced when discussion time is over. He positioned himself slightly to the side, opening a clear path away from the nurse's station, making the expectation obvious without touching her. He explained the decision publicly and professionally so there was no confusion for anyone watching. He stated that she was not staff, not administration, and not authorized to direct hospital operations. He said interference with patient care and staff movement could not continue, and for safety reasons she had to exit the wing. His tone stayed neutral, not embarrassed, not apologetic, just factual. This wasn't punishment. It was procedure. The shift in the room was instant. Nurses who had been stiff and hyper-aware visibly relaxed. Shoulders dropped. Movement smoothed out. A cart rolled past without hesitation. A nurse resumed a conversation mid-sentence like a pause button had been released. The wing breathed again, the way it's supposed to when real authority reasserts itself. Karen tried to speak, lips parting like she still believed there was something left to argue, but the officer gently raised a hand and repeated the instruction. He didn't threaten her. He didn't escalate. He simply restated the boundary and waited. That quiet confidence carried more weight than shouting ever could. Hospital operations resumed around them almost immediately. Nurses stepped around Karen without engaging, eyes forward, priorities locked back onto patients. A tech pushed a supply cart through the space she'd been standing in minutes earlier, not slowing this time. The flow corrected itself naturally, like a system snapping back into alignment once an obstruction was removed. Karen's face tightened, frustration flashing through the confidence she'd been clinging to. She hugged the clipboard tighter against her chest, muttering something about responsibility and oversight. No one responded. The audience she'd been performing for no longer existed. The wing had moved on without her. The officer took a step closer, still calm, and gestured again toward the exit. 2 additional security staff appeared at the far end of the hallway, not rushing, just present. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was time to go. Karen hesitated for a beat, clearly processing the fact that this wasn't going her way. She looked around for support, for someone to validate her authority claim. She found none. Nurses avoided eye contact. Visitors stared openly now, disbelief etched across their faces. Whatever credibility she thought she'd built had evaporated completely. She finally took a step, then another, guided by the officer at a respectful distance. He didn't grab her or rush her. He simply walked with her, controlling the pace and direction. The lack of drama made it more effective. This wasn't a spectacle. It was removal. As she moved down the hallway, the wing reclaimed itself behind her. Conversations resumed at normal volume. A monitor beeped, acknowledged immediately. A patient laughed softly at something a nurse said. The ordinary sounds of care returned, washing away the tension she dragged in. Karen muttered under her breath as she walked, complaining about standards and liability, but her words faded quickly into the background noise. Nobody followed. Nobody argued. Nobody cared enough to engage. The further she went, the smaller she seemed, just another person being escorted out of a place she never belonged. At the edge of the wing, the officer stopped and told her she needed to remain outside the secured area. He thanked her for cooperating, tone polite but distant, and turned back without waiting for a response. That was it. Plain. Professional. Done. Karen stood there for a moment, clutching her clipboard like it might still mean something, then adjusted her blazer and walked away. The wing didn't watch her leave. It didn't need to. Her exit wasn't the focus anymore. The work was. Inside, the hospital returned fully to its rhythm. Nurses moved with purpose. Patients were attended to without distraction. Visitors sat quietly, reassured by the competence surrounding them. The disruption already felt unreal, like something that had happened in a different place entirely. No announcements were made. No apologies were issued. None were needed. Authority had spoken, and the result was immediate and absolute. The absence of Karen's voice was louder than anything she'd said all shift. What lingered wasn't anger or applause. It was silence. A deep, telling quiet that settled over the wing once she was gone, signaling that the situation had ended and would not be revisited. But the silence afterward said everything. The hospital wing settled back into its natural rhythm almost immediately, like a machine that had been briefly jammed and then released. Nurses moved with quiet confidence, shoes squeaking softly against the polished floor as they returned to patient rooms and stations without hesitation. Conversations resumed at low volume, clipped and efficient, the way they always were when care came first. The tension that had tightened the space earlier dissolved so fast it almost felt imaginary. Monitors continued their steady beeping, a familiar soundtrack that no longer felt intrusive. 4 poles rolled smoothly alongside beds, carts passed without needing detours, and staff no longer adjusted their paths to avoid a problem that had already been removed. The wing felt lighter, calmer, and unmistakably back under the control of people who actually belonged there. Patients remained undisturbed, which was the real win. A woman resting near the nurse's station drifted back into sleep, her breathing slow and even. A man waiting for test results cracked a small smile when a nurse checked in, reassured by the normalcy returning around him. Family members relaxed their shoulders, no longer scanning the hallway for interruptions or raised voices. Whatever confusion had briefly unsettled them was gone. Nurses continued care like nothing had happened. Meds were delivered on time. Charts were updated. Quiet jokes were exchanged between coworkers who just dealt with something bizarre and were already moving past it. One nurse shook her head and muttered, "That was wild," to another who replied, "Yeah, but it's over," before heading into a room. That was the extent of the commentary. Professionals didn't dwell on nonsense. Security stepped back into the background, eyes still alert but posture relaxed. They didn't need to hover. The situation had resolved cleanly, and the wing no longer required intervention. Real authority has a way of making itself invisible once it does its job properly. Visitors adjusted back into waiting mode, sitting where they'd been sitting before, flipping through phones or magazines, voices kept low out of instinct. A few people exchanged quiet looks that said, "Did you see that?" followed by a subtle shrug. The moment didn't demand discussion. It was already sliding into that weird thing that happened earlier territory. Karen was completely gone. Not lingering by the elevators. Not hovering near the doors. Not trying to reinsert herself from a distance. Gone in the most final way possible. The wing didn't miss her presence and it didn't acknowledge her absence either. She had been a disruption, not a participant, and the space corrected itself the moment she was removed. The nurse's station buzzed again with focused energy. Screens glowed with patient information, keyboards clicked, and staff leaned in briefly to exchange updates before moving on. Nobody referenced clipboards, standards, or oversight anymore. The only standards that mattered here were medical, and they were already being met without drama. Care continued uninterrupted, which was exactly how it should be. A tech wheeled a patient down the hallway, chatting softly to keep them calm. A nurse reassured a worried family member with a practiced smile and steady tone. The environment reclaimed its purpose fully, leaving no room for ego or pretend authority. If anyone was still filming, they stopped. The story had ended. There was nothing left to capture. The aftermath wasn't explosive or emotional. It was quiet, controlled, and satisfying in a way only proper resolution can be. Chaos doesn't always end with shouting. Sometimes it ends with silence and people getting back to work. A doctor passed through the wing, nodded at a nurse, and kept moving, unaware of the nonsense that had briefly tried to stake a claim there. That was the ultimate proof of irrelevance. The hospital didn't change course. It didn't adapt to Karen's demands. It didn't even register them once they were gone. Patients received care without knowing how close their calm environment had come to being hijacked by someone who confused confidence for authority. That ignorance was a blessing. Hospitals work best when patients don't have to think about anything beyond healing, and the staff protected that space exactly as they were trained to do. By the time the shift rolled on, the disruption already felt distant, like something that happened on a different floor or a different day. Nurses laughed quietly about unrelated things. Visitors focused on loved ones. The wing moved forward, uninterested in revisiting the moment. There were no announcements. No explanations. No apologies issued to Karen or demanded by anyone else. None were necessary. The situation had been handled correctly, and the outcome spoke for itself. She claimed she was in charge of a hospital wing, and learned clipboards don't outrank medical authority.